Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to this roundtable hearing on a gloomy Friday evening. But it's just the luck of the draw and how our schedules are for the public hearing rooms. But we're going to have another roundtable hearing sometime midweek, if not sooner, probably sometime mid-afternoon, not earlier. But I'd like to recognize the Vice Speaker and thank him for being here. Also with us tonight, and I'll give you opportunity to introduce yourselves. We have representatives from the Department of Labor. Senator Mabini is here, and the deputies here, and Wage and Hour is here, and the economist, Mr. Howes, is here. Gita is here as well, Mr. Rojas, and I also see Guam Hotel Restaurant Association chairman, and Ms. Rose is here, and the chamber just walked in, and several of you are certainly stakeholders in this issue. In accordance with the open government law, notices of this roundtable meeting were sent to all main media outlets, all senators and stakeholders 5 days in advance on September 23rd, and a second notice was sent on September 27th. The focus on tonight's roundtable hearing, as you know, the bill made it to the session agenda, and the Vice Speaker agreed to make a motion to bring the bill back to my Committee on Labor so we can discuss two things. We can discuss, well, we know that the study, while it's cleared the Attorney General's office and they're now working on it, we know that the study is not going to be done till the end of December. So that's the reality. The second reality is we wanted to generate a discussion on how we're proceeding with tip credits. Department of Labor is here so they can clarify how tip credits are to be applied to the employee, and I want to get that out of the way because I think that's one of the main issues with this first roundtable. Is just let's start off on the clear understanding of what the minimum wage law is and how tips are to be applied to the minimum wage law. I want to give each of you an opportunity to just introduce yourselves, and then I'll recognize the Director of Labor, and then I'm sure she would recognize her, Mr. Kanata, to give an overview. So we'll start with you, Senator Mabini.
Good evening, Mr. Chair. Good evening, Senators. Cruz, Sam Mabini, the Director of Department of Labor, and along with me are my two colleagues.
Okay.
Gary Hiles, Chief Economist, Department of Labor.
Roman Kinata, Administrator of Wage and Hour Division.
Okay. We just go down this way. Jay.
Today, I'm Jay Rojas, the Administrator for GITA.
Good evening. I'm Gary Schiff, Brand Management Director for Subway and Chili's, representing those brands tonight.
Buenas noches, Speaker, Vice Speaker, and Senator. Joe Blas from the Chairman of the Guam Hotel Restaurant Association.
Hafaday, Mary Rhodes from the Guam Hotel Restaurant Association.
Hi there, I'm Catherine Castro with the Guam Chamber of Commerce.
Jeff Jones, Triple J, and also the Guam Chamber.
Frank Cruz, Guam Fast Foods.
And keeping the Frank theme, Frank Kenny from Jamaican Grill.
And I also see on the sign-up sheet, Mr. Andrews is here from the Employers Council. Do you want to join us? Would you want to join us? Yeah. Anybody else in the audience that we have extra seats here? Okay. So let's, one of the biggest areas when we had our public hearing was this tips. And according to the Department of Labor, there's no such thing as tip credit. And it was confirmed by Mary at the roundtable that if an employee is to receive a tip, that it has to be on top of the minimum wage. And so let me ask the Department of Labor to make that, to generate that, to start off that discussion. And you can also let us know how long you've been interpreting this way and why the interpretation is as such.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I'll go ahead and defer to our Administrator in Wage and Hour.
Thank you.
Mr. Kanata.
Okay.
Okay, the way I've been interpreting it, it's the law was passed since 1961. I was just 6 years old then. Our provision in the law, when we read the definition of wages, it says that tips or gratuity of any kind cannot be included to offset the minimum wage. So flat out, the employer must pay the minimum wage of what Guam has. And if they want to use the service charge or the gratuities, it is their prerogative whether they give it to the employees. Tips, even in the federal provision, belongs to the employees. Okay? So if the employees report it to you folks, the employers, then they file it and pay the taxes. But it's been since way back on how we interpret the rule. It's always minimum wage must be paid, and whatever the service charge that you feel you want to do with it, you can do with whatever you want to do with that service charge. You can give it to the employees, or you can keep it. Because you'll be reporting the gross receipts on that too. But when you give the service charge above the minimum wage, then employees pay part of those taxes. So the rule has been in place ever since 1961.
So even with service charge, you cannot use that to offset the employees?
Right, even with service charge. But which one?
Go ahead, Mary. Yeah.
But when the dollar increase took place 2 years ago, the language changed where it actually excluded tips and gratuities from that language. So it ended up saying just $8.25 versus before it used to say minimum wage not including, with tips and gratuities. So it was allowed before to do tip credit. So we're in a situation where the U.S. U.S. Department of Labor allows tip credit, but local law oversees, or actually is a stronger mandate with $8.25 as the minimum. But with the changes, it was not proposed in the changes to say $8.25. Sorry, I always talk close to $8.25 plus tips and gratuities. That language does not exist today. It only says $8.25. So that's why
it still didn't exist back then when it was $7.25 or.
But it had
because we automatically our provision in our law automatically switches over to the federal if they are higher than us. Okay? But the definition of the wages in our provision never changed. It stayed the same. It still says that tips, however, tips or gratuities of any kind cannot be used to meet minimum wage.
And this interpretation was always the same before and after
always,
the minimum wage increase was made by dollar.
Right.
But the challenge was Guam was in line with the federal. So that's why tip credit was allowed. So it's still allowed today under federal law. But Guam's law, because it passed 825, presents a situation where it exceeds the federal law. So it just states 825 is the base.
So what does the Department of Labor do when there's a conflict between federal
I'd like
and
to
local
talk
law?
about that. There's no conflict between federal and local law.
Well, the perceived conflict. I'm not saying there is, but
Okay, but I want to clarify that they're not in conflict. If the laws are in conflict, then the federal law would prevail. But if, let's say, federal law required payment of $7 and local law required payment of $10, then if you paid only $7, then you would meet the federal requirement and the federal government would not enforce it against you. However, you would not be in compliance with the local law, which required $10. So it's very often that there's a local statute, like a local speed limit, that this is a local road, there's no federal requirement. So if you go 50 miles an hour down a side street on Guam, you'll be subject to local prosecution, but the federal government won't enforce because you're not in violation of the federal law. So there would only be a conflict if the federal government said you must pay less than $7 and the local said you must pay more than $7. Then they would be in conflict and the federal would prevail. But as long as one standard is lower, if you meet the lower one, you'll be exempt from enforcement action for meeting the lower standard. But if you don't meet the higher standard, or in the case that the federal government doesn't have any law in that regard, you would still be responsible for meeting the local law.
But if employers chose to pay the federal minimum wage of $7.25, they would be in violation of local law.
Yes, that's correct.
And there could be some penalties.
Right.
And the federal person, Patrick, will always remind employers that. He will always say that federal minimum wage is $7.25. However, Guam law is $8.25. So you must follow the one that benefits the employee the most. So the Guam provision prevails then.
Excuse me, Senator.
Go ahead. Please speak into the mic.
Yeah, Senator, excuse me. Has there ever been any attempt in history trying to address the issue, the tip credit issue as it relates to the hourly rate? Has there ever been legislation or discussion in having a different wage scale for service employees in reference to the hotel restaurant industry, paying a lower fee, which is very common throughout the country in the U.S., in which people that have that job description as a profession are paid, a lower rate, and the tips are actually used to compensate, thus bringing up their wage to at or above the minimum wage. Has that ever been talked, discussed?
Actually, at the hearing, it was recommended that was something that we should look at, because I think that there was just a misunderstanding during the minimum wage hearing that people were being underpaid. And what they didn't realize was that some businesses pay following tip credit. It's not that they're underpaid, they're just paid according to the federal wage, which is a lower amount, but it's adjusted to include their their tips. But no matter what, the employer always has to meet the minimum wage. But more often than not, they make a lot more than the minimum wage, and that's what you want to encourage in the service industry. But there was a misunderstanding, or just no understanding at all on the values of that type of payment. And so I think the challenge is that you're all members of GHRA, and we talk about this all of the time, and I think that there's value in a lot of those things. What's happening in what the Vice Speaker has found with Senator Nicholas and some other senators, including Senator Talmata, is that in talking to their constituents, businesses that aren't necessarily members of GHRA, small businesses, aren't paying the employees properly or including their tips. And that is something that actually does not require additional legislation, that they just need to follow the law, and they need to be reported to Department of Labor, Wage and Hour Division. That's really the issue. So there was a lot of time spent, if you look at during that public hearing also 2 years ago, during those hearings, that we were actually trying to get clarification on how each is paid, whether it's minimum wage, tip credit, how service charge is applied, and the different variations of it. But at the end of the day, the employer is required to pay their wages, their due wages, including the tips, and it's up to the employee to declare those wages.
Mary, can you clarify they're required to pay their tips on top of their minimum wage?
That's correct. And our systems, our POS systems, include ways to record the tips for each employee. There's There are companies that are regularly checked by Department of Labor, U.S. Department of Labor on these types of things, and I know that there's been a lot of counseling with businesses on how to recognize tips after each sale, and they have to report it after each shift because each of the employees have to ensure that they're recording this. But the employers, they report the service charge and they pay the taxes on that. Right? So there's a difference in all of that, and I think that that's what took place during the minimum wage hearing is a lot of education regarding that, and what it ended up being was that we're really not talking about the good employers. We're really talking about the employers who aren't properly paying their employees, and the laws are in the books for that already. We just have to enforce it.
Well, maybe it's because of lack of an understanding or lack of information, not because that's what they want to do. Mr. Kenny, is that your understanding of how the employees are to be paid?
Well, yeah, I mean, here on Guam, I got to tell you, the front of the house service staff is, I think, are paid like well above the national averages for service personnel within the same industry, in the sense that they are, get paid the $8.25 per hour plus tips. So in a lot of, good tipped out restaurants, a front of the house employee could be easily making $20, $25 an hour, which is great in one sense, but in the same sense too, from an industry standpoint in the States, and I know Guam and States is completely different, but this law was impacted in 1961, and saying this is the way it is. We as a industry have to pay employees the Guam minimum wage mandate, in this case $8.25, and then we're required to pay the tips in full also as well, right? So I guess my question is has this issue of paying service personnel ever been looked at in decreasing the minimum wage for service personnel? Service personnel at Jamaican Grill, makes up, 25% of the employees. So I'm just wondering if it was ever looked at, that's all, as far as minimum wage, but less of a minimum wage for service personnel, knowing they make it up from the tips. I mean, has that ever been brought to the table? That's just my question. Oh, it has not.
Well, one of the confusions is in the federal system, even though an employee has to make $7.25, how you get there, there's a difference in how you get there. You can make, currently right now, you can pay as little as $2.13 an hour on a federal, for federal wages, but you have to have a $5.12 an hour tip wage credit to get to that. And so I guess from the Guam employers, from the restaurant industry and service industry, ultimately I think that the intention of the minimum wage legislation is to make sure everybody's paid at least $8.25 an hour. That's the way I understand the purpose of minimum wage, to make sure everybody who's working makes at least $8.25 an hour. The way it comes across now is they make $8.25 an hour, plus they may make another $5, $10 an hour in tips, which puts them well above national average, and it actually adds another burden to the businesses. So what's happening is that service charge, like some restaurants would give the complete service charge to the employee previously. So they would make their wages plus service charge. As long as they were making $7.25 or an hour or more, then we were in compliance. But what's happening now is that because the minimum wage got to $8.25, they're giving them $8.25 plus the tips on the table, and the companies are taking the service charge completely or partially to help offset that increase in the wages. So it seems to me that if the intention of the minimum wage legislation is to make sure everybody makes at least $8.25 an hour, there should be some provision there so that tip credit can be applied to get there. So at least everyone's making at least that amount. I think that's where the GHRA and the chamber is hoping there can be some discussion about how we calculate that tip wage and tip credit. Because it's allowable under the federal system, it's just not allowable under the Guam law.
I should make a note here as well. I'm reading from an article here by Nicholas Bierman and Rochelle Nelson. Pardon my speech here, a little dental work here. This is an article, they are lawyers with the law firm of Fisher Phillips. Quote, in most western states, however, employers are not permitted to take a tip credit, including California, Nevada, Washington, Oregon, Montana, and Alaska, pursuant to their state law. Restaurants in these states are required to pay employees cash wages at minimum wage levels regardless of the tips they receive. Now also there's a big hoorah between the U.S. Department of Labor and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals regarding tip pooling. The U.S. Department of Labor has said repeatedly, and they stand by it, the tips belong to the employee, not to anyone else. And they've also issued rules that you can't make them give up or share their tips with others who are not normally or customarily receive tips, referring to the people in the back of the house, the cooks, the restaurants, the cooks, the dishwashers, and so on. So, call that to your attention.
Just to provide clarification, Andy's correct. That's actually in the Fair Labor Standards Act, and it's also in the poster and everything else of that they cannot pull that and pay for back of the house, and also who's exempt from that. But the thing is, in addition to what Jeff had mentioned, he was starting to introduce service charge. So it's, that's at the discretion of the employer, according to federal laws. And so the trend has been really, if you're going to continue to increase that, like Jeff had mentioned, you'll see businesses start pulling that away. I mentioned in my testimony that in other markets, like New York City and other places, they're starting to pull away service charge completely because they increased to $15 an hour or even more now. So those types of, those markets, when you're starting to increase the costs to the labor costs, where there were incentives already built in, the companies tend to respond to that in a way where they have to offset it somewhere rather than putting it in the pricing. And so that's the risk you run, and I think that what we need to find is a nice balance. And the balance that we're suggesting is to bring back tip credit, because at the end of the day, the employer has that agreement with the employee. And by the way, tips are, in addition to what Andy mentioned, tips have to be paid out according to that shift. It has to be paid out to who worked during that period as well. And so there's a lot of really, and these employers have to be very careful on how they administer this and document it. And that's why it's very important to report it at the end of every shift, because those tips have to be paid out to those who worked during that period and those who are eligible for that. What I was going to bring up on the service charge, or I'm sorry, on the tips, is that they definitely have to be paid out during that hour, and so it's very important that each of those employees report it. But if they are going to be taking away the service charge, then you're going to see increases in pricing. And so that's very important when we're starting to look at this, and that's why we're looking for that balance, because at the end of the day, if, let's say we do tip credit, and we can go as low as $5.25 an hour, but they make it up in tips. If, let's say they have a 4-hour shift, and it's a slow night because of the rain. At the end of the day, if there are no tips, the employer still has to pay $8.25 per hour, regardless of tips. So they're still mandated by law to pay minimum $8.25. They have the opportunity to make more, but they never go below $8.25. And I think that is something that needs to be shared, because, the industry, it has peak seasons, non-peak seasons. There are periods when there are just going to be no customers because of our inclement weather, depending on, and then also based on service and quality. So that all varies.
But in your scenario, the employee's out $12.
Well, they're not really out
and
because
you bring them down to $5.25. They're
no.
We pay the difference.
No, you have to pay
I
the
know,
difference. The
but
employer.
it would be 100 based on labor's interpretation. It'll be all of their tips plus $8.25 an hour. So
That's it. No.
if we go back to tip wages in that scenario, the employee is going to be out $12 for that night.
But
because-
technically, there are no tips to claim. So that's why the employer is
tips.
out. No, but I'm saying if there are no customers to tip that evening,
Yeah, then they get their minimum wage.
they get the minimum wage with the employer has to pay that regardless if there are customers that evening.
But in your
So it
scenario,
washes.
if they were brought down to $5.25 an hour for those 4 hours, they're out $12 because the tips would have supplemented their minimum wage income.
But there are no sales that evening, so the employer.
There's no customers.
Yeah.
There are no customers, and so the employer pays the full wages. But, everybody's out because the employer's out, no revenue in food sales or beverage sales or anything like that. But at the end of the day, the employee is still protected, is my point. To always get minimum wage. But the upside with tip credit, is that there's always room for them to get more than the minimum wage, regardless. But they're always protected to get minimum wage, despite the economic conditions.
Maybe somebody can enlighten me on what this 20% service charge is and whether or not a patron has the ability to refuse to pay the service charge.
Service charge is not mandatory. It's really up to the business. A lot of businesses don't even charge service charge.
No, I understand, but the patron, if
I
I go into a
understand, but
restaurant
if
and they put a service charge of 20% on,
I can tell you the average service charge is actually 10% on Guam. You won't find 20% automatically on Guam. You'll find that in the States.
Okay.
10% is the average.
whatever the price, the service charge is, does the patron have the right to refuse to pay that service charge?
No, if it's part of the pricing already in there, and that's actually what Senator Atta has recommended, is that the businesses, that's the alternate bill here that he's been wanting to put out, is that businesses should at least have something at the register or in the check that what service charge, that there is that there is a service charge, and whether or not it's shared with the employees, whatever the policy is. But, that's all subject because it's discretionary to the employer. But again, not all business, that's not a mandatory thing. That's the discretion of the employer and that business. And so there are a lot of businesses to this day who do not charge service charge.
Does the customer have to pay the service charge, though?
If it's part of their establishment and their pricing, yes. If it's on the bill.
I've been around customers that just said, no, I'm not paying it. The service is rotten. I'm not going to do it.
Well, I don't know. I don't know
Restaurant
if,
said, okay.
I don't know anyone who's said no to it, but.
Well, I've been here.
Senator,
And I've been prompted
You
to
said
do
no?
it myself.
Gary
a
said
couple
no.
times.
in the 27 years in the hotel industry here on Guam, there's only one occasion where a customer says, I didn't get no service on the 10%. And of course, when you do the internal investigation or the inquiry at that point, that the guest was adamant that, hey, I'm not paying for it, so what do you do? Well, the guest is always right. We don't pay. But there's only one instance in my 20, close to 30 years in the industry on Guam that we paid that back. Others, because some of our visitors now are not accustomed to tipping. And we have a system where no tip. And everything that comes to there is, most of it goes back to the employees. Because some customers right now, even the local says, no, I know you're charging me 10%, but I want to give more. Well, okay. But yeah, I must admit, one time in close to 30 years that I give somebody back their $2.15. Because oh, it wasn't
In the industry, what is the standard regarding service charge? How does the employer typically allocate this? How did they decide who gets?
Well, it's really up to the employer because it's not mandated how they use it. So it could be used it could be split with them. Some of them use it for the back of the house employees because the tip is not allowed to be used for that. Based on federal law, you can't split the tips between the bussers or the
Tips.
tip. I'm just saying tips. So
service charge.
right. So what happens is some employers, restaurants use that to compensate the back of the house staff, the cooks and dishwashers. So it just depends on the operation.
How about
Some
how about the management?
I don't know. I guess it's up to their discretion. But in my experience, it usually goes to service staff, either front or back.
Yeah.
You know, or both.
In the industry, on the service charge we do, because we collect, we give most of it back to the employees in terms of benefits.
Which employees?
The employees, rank and file employees. And these are the traditional employees that work in restaurants. And some of it actually because of the support staff, like, and say which employees, the kitchen staff, for instance, the cooks. They're identified as a support staff to the restaurant. So we have a formula that we say, okay, so much percentage to the traditional employees that actually wait staff, and follows on for the cooks and like that employees. Okay, and again, majority it goes back. Based on how we do that formula, we have breakage. We have somebody has to pay for that one. We don't let the employees pay for something when they drop something, whatever. No, but we use some of that back to employees. So basically, in a nutshell, everything goes back to the employees if you would like that on the service charge. Now the tips, like again, there's a lot of questions at what is the average tips that I should give? I'm from Japan. I don't tip. What is the average? Well, we say, 10% for us is doable for here. And there's some locals accept 15%. Oh, in the States, 20%. I want to give some. Well, this is what we got. And then 10% is added to your bill. Basically, it's reasonable for what I hear. Again, that's what we hear. Even from the employees, that they believe that nobody's ever questioned them about the service charge. And they still, we call it pillow tips. Somebody puts cash on the table. That's theirs. We don't even go there to touch that.
You're hanging out with a lot of nice people.
Well, you got some employees that don't want to leave the hotel for some reason. We're doing something good. But maybe because to training with Department of Labor, we've been so many trainings with Department of Labor on how we do this to make the employees more healthier and the quality of life. Yeah, at the end of the day, 825 is the issue. I mean, if you stick with that one, Department of Labor won't be on your back. So that's how we can operate. And employees are very happy. Of course, with a free meal, duty meal, they're even happier. So basically, back to the employees.
Yeah, Senator, I'd like to add, just for me, in my own point of view, and just the experience that we've had at Jamaican Grill over the past 22 years that we've been very blessed to operate here on Guam. One of the reasons why I'm interested in this tip credit is because of the escalation of the minimum wage, over a course of a 20-year history. And if you go back to 1990, the minimum wage went up 2 times, from 1990 to 1991, at 45 cents an hour. A number of years later, in 1996, it went up an additional 50 cents and 40 cents, thus bringing it up to 5.15. So you had 2 segments of 2 years of increases at around 40 to 45 cents. And then a number of years later, in 2007, the law that was passed, the minimum wage went up in not a 2-year increment of 40 to 45 cents, but actually a 3-year increment of 70 cents each. So at the end of that 3 years, the minimum wage went up from $5.85 to $7.25. Now, with the recent proposal of minimum wage out there, we've just incurred a 1-year increase from $7.25 to $8.25. Right, that was in January 1st, 2015. But what's being proposed henceforth is another increase of a whole $1, and after that, an additional 85 cents. So what we're seeing traditionally over the course of the past 20 years is a 2-year tier at 50 cents, right, a couple of times, and then a 3-year tier at 70 cents, And then now currently what's in the process of happening is another 3-year tier. Only one of them has been implemented so far, right? With this current one, potentially if it goes up to $10.10, that will be an increase over a 3 or 4 or 5 year period, whatever it is, of $2.85 added to the minimum wage. So if this particular trend continues to develop as is over the moving forward in the next 5, 10, 15 years, just keeping to what's been done over the past 20 years, we might see, minimum wage increases of $1.50, $2 for 3 years in a row. So, for me, I'm kind of concerned, just given the industry that I'm in and the majority of our employees, start off at the minimum wage, and we as a business try to develop them into positions of higher pay over the course of time. But I'm concerned because just for me, the way the minimum wage is going, we're really faced with some real profit margin issues as a business in our industry. We are, very thin profit margins, and if the minimum wage continues to increase as is proposed, we're kind of concerned, like how is this going to affect us? And we as a business, pay all of our taxes to the government, and and give generously to the community that supports us. But that's why I'm interested in this tax credit, is that we need, as a business, where are we going to be able to get some of this money to help offset the cost of significant wage increases for us? Yeah.
Would you be in favor of the bill then if the tip credit was applied?
Possibly. I think I'd have to know some details, but at least it's a step, in helping employers, use some of the money to help offset, some of these increases. Because, for our market right now at Guam, at $8.25 right now, there's 31 states in the U.S. that have a lower minimum wage than Guam. Puerto Rico, a territory that we're all familiar with, also has a minimum wage of $7.25. So for us to move from $8.25 to $9.25 to $10.10 just really has me concerned, again, from a restaurant industry perspective with small profit margins, what am I going to do? You can only raise the price. You hear this argument, you can always raise the prices so much, with the potential of, patrons once they think your product is, not reasonably priced. But I think traditionally speaking, when minimum wages go up, the price of goods and services go up along with it. So with that being said, I can give you a brief example, not from kind of related to minimum wage, but this one's related to the federal mandate of salaried minimum wage for exempt overtime employees due to take effect December 1st of this year. So what the federal government has done in their wisdom, right, is take the minimum wage of a salaried overtime exempt employee at $23,600, and over the course of a night, they are moving that wage up to $47,476, 100% increase overnight. And so the federal government, just like the Guam government, right, has the best interest for its people, but yet they came up with a law and a mandate that's not practical. So instead of employers paying that new minimum wage, right, like we're supposed to, it's in Jamaican Grill's part, we're not going to be able to afford that minimum wage. So we have 20 employees at Jamaican Grill that are currently on salary. All of them will be made hourly positions. But I just bring that up because employers are going to have to deal with that across the country, not only here on Guam. But again, it's just an example of what we have, and we'll be compliant with whatever comes down the pike. But businesses are forced to make decisions based on what's mandated to us by the governments, whether it's the federal government or the Guam government, and so we have to make decisions. And so this tax credit, if passed, and if acceptable to all parties, can help as a tool to help offset some of these increases that seem to be coming. Yeah.
If I can capitalize on some of the things that you said here, do you know what the first minimum wage was? 25 cents an hour back in 1938. Incidentally, the U.S. was not the first country to establish a minimum wage. I think it was New Zealand, maybe 50 years before that. 25 cents an hour. Since then, the federal minimum wage has increased 2,900%. If you throw Guam's minimum wage in, that's 3,300%. I've always questioned the motivation. Typically, they throw the reasoning out as this is a cure for poverty. I ask you, do we still have poverty? It's thriving. I contend that the issue is not a minimum wage. Quite frankly, I think it's political pandering, particularly in an election year. The issue is the education, training, and development of our community. I think that's the route to success, not just the mere waving of a one-paragraph statement that says, now poverty is cured, minimum wage is going up. Tackling the education, training, and development is a much more difficult process. And I challenge, the legislature to focus more on that. What was it, a couple of days ago? Headlines, front page, PDN. What was the test scores? Dismal. Very dismal. Yet we're anticipating paying minimum wage for a lot of these people who can't really accomplish anything in the schools. So I'll throw that out for your consideration.
I just wanted
Henry Ford once said, and I like to fall back on all these quotes, the customers pay the wages, we just hold the money for a while. Now, when the minimum wage goes up, yep, we're going to see big headlines. Minimum wage goes up. But when the hotel increases their prices, you never hear about it. When Payless increases the prices of the tomatoes, you never hear about it. But eventually, it all comes back. And so an increase in the minimum wage is going to come back to haunt us all, whether it gets the headlines or not. So whatever you're flaunting, keep in mind, you're going to have to pay the fiddler here sometime before long.
Okay. I just want to address one thing where you allege the political pandering. Because when I introduced the bill 3 years ago to increase the minimum wage, it was, as Frank explained, a 3-year program, because I wanted the next one to be in a non-election year.
Oh.
It wasn't supposed to be. When it was 2 years, it was always during an election year that it came up. So that's why it was introduced as a 3-year thing, so it would be in a non-election year that it came back up. And when the requirement was to have the study done, and the Department of Labor failed to get the study done in time, it made it closer and closer to the election. But if the original bill that I had introduced when Senator Sam was here, it would have been 95 cents, 95 cents, 95 cents, and the last one would have been in 17. And if there was going to be another increase, it would have been during the year 2017, which is a non-election year, and you could make a decision on whether or not you're going to increase it again. But
Very well.
It was to try to do it in a non-election year so you wouldn't have it.
Then
It was I had never designed it to be I wanted it to not be. That's why they changed from the pattern of 2 years to 3 years to make it non-election year. And the last one that was made here in 2007, we passed it in July, and the federal government changed it in August. Okay, the proposal of 95 cents for the 3 years, was not original thought on my part. I wish I had thought about it. This was exactly the federal, the one that was being proposed in the U.S. Congress and has been sitting in the U.S. Congress for the last 5 years. I didn't change it. I wanted it to be the way that the Congress had proposed it, 95 cents, 95 cents, 95 cents, and would be done in a non-election year, but there was an insistence on a study, which then threw off the thing, and the second and third increments weren't implemented.
Well, then explain for us the motivation, and if it's not political pandering.
It's not political pandering.
Then what
It
is the motivation?
is.
What is
to,
the motivation?
because when a person works 40 hours a week, they shouldn't have to starve.
Well,
And then you want to have a question for everybody else here? Break down the number of your employees who are getting EITC credits and how much that's costing the government. Because when one employer came up to me and insisted that he was opposed to the minimum wage, I said, I'll come back and I'll talk to you. Do me a favor first. Go back into your payroll, because you just issued your payroll this week when I first brought this up in March. You just issued your W-2 forms. You'll be able to see how much you paid your employees and how many exemptions they claim or deductions they claim. Go on the website and go to EITC calculator. Punch in the amount, punch in the deduction that the person has on the W-2 form, and figure out how much that person's going to be getting in EITC. EITC costs this government $60 million every year because they're not getting enough pay from the rest of out there.
But regardless of the timing of this, this bill going to 1010, there's a reason why it didn't go through Congress. It's not the right fit for every state or every territory, and that's why it didn't go through, and that's why a lot of the states chose to go on their own way. We always have to remember what Guam's market can endure and bear, and we, as an industry that relies heavily on tourism, we do not compete in the United States. We compete in Southeast Asia. And so our costs are nowhere near what we compete with for service and quality in those places. Plus, as an island, we are so subject to so many costs with the imports of goods and fuel and everything else that really increases. And Guam is expensive to do business in. If you look at everything that are requirements here on this island that businesses have to pay for compared to other markets, Guam is expensive, and also Guam's expensive to live in. So I understand what you're saying, but I can tell you anyone who works 40 hours or more is not probably even qualify for the EITC. You're really talking about part-time casual employees if you look at the hours and what they qualify at. That's what that threshold is really there for. And that's why a lot of people actually work part-time jobs.
I'm
Stay in
just
that.
saying, go away and count the number of employees that you have in your
But don't you think that's
organization.
by design, if they're going to work part-time hours
No,
and
if they're
qualify
not,
for that?
They're full-time. They're full-time.
Well, the EITC is an unfunded federal mandate, and that's something that the government of Guam and the federal government really have to work out.
That's not private
and I
sector's
understand.
That's not our
responsibility.
And
responsibility,
I
but
think if you listen to the debate in the U.S. Congress on the minimum wage, you will find many congressmen saying, don't bother with raising the minimum wage. Let's just deal with it in the EITC.
Well, the EITC
Let's make sure that people aren't starving by giving them $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 in March or April of every year, and we won't have to deal with it in a minimum wage. Just read the stories of the discussions.
But you're trying to hold
that's true, though,
responsible the private sector for all those things, whether it's the earned income tax credit, the uninsured market, Medicaid, Medicare populations. All those things are government responsibilities, which we already pay taxes for. They are not the responsibility of private sector to pay twice over because we already pay our fair share in taxes. That is the government's responsibility to manage those programs and to pay them accordingly.
Well, one of the reasons EITC is used is because it's been shown to be very effective in preventing poverty, because it also requires people to file their taxes. They have to file the taxes in order to get EITC, and they have to see how many people in their household. And so it's an effective way. Unfortunately for Guam, it comes out of our pocket, which I understand. You know, that's a big part of our budget. But speaking of, one other thing I want to bring up is is on the minimum wage is the youth. You know what the current minimum wage is for youth, federal mandated for those under 20 years old? It's $4.25 is the federal mandated minimum wage for youth under 20 years old. And the reason they do that, it's only good for 90 days. The reason they do that is because it allows kids to come out of college, or out of high school, not out of college, out of high school, or when they're in high school, and get part-time work and get a experience in working. If we continue to raise the minimum wage, $8.25, $9.25, $10, wherever it's headed, we're going to completely lock out the youth out of that market, because an unskilled worker is not going to be able to get a job at 10, especially a high school student. And the reason I have the 90-day cap is because after 90 days they should be trained, or they should be going back to school if it's a summer job. So I think that's one of the things that we need to also make a provision in this minimum wage is a youth wage under 20 years old, allowing them to, whatever it's $7.25 or $4.25 or $5.20, whatever it is, allowing them to get a work experience and get into the workforce. Because that's part of our problem is the kids never make it in the workforce, and they end up,
If I may, my name is John Song. I'm not a GHRA member. I'm not a GVB member, but I am a private citizen who also is a part-time business owner, part-time employee as a cashier. Just a couple items of clarification. With regard to the restrictions on the tips and gratuities, that's under Title 22 GCA Section 3104F, which includes other compensatory items such as room and board. Which allows for things such as facilities, room and board, lodging, etc., as part of wages. However, it specifically excludes tips and gratuities. That's why we cannot follow the federal system unless you amend subsection F. If you were to take the tips and gratuities language out of that subsection, then pretty much automatically we would fall back to the federal Labor Standards Act with regard to the tip credit system. So it's very possible and very easily doable to do that. However, on my part, that has no bearing on my part-time business, because my part-time business does not have an employee that receives tips and wages. So since last year, my net profit has gone from $200 a month to $100 a month. This next proposed increase will put me in the hole. My part-time employee makes more money than I do in this part-time business. Furthermore, as a part-time employee, I get paid $10 an hour. Now, the two people who are my coworkers who I supervise will be making the same amount I will, even though I've worked longer, I've worked harder, and I know more. That being said, that's my personal situation. Now, with regard to, I think, what Mr. Jones was referring to, there's actually a system in place to do that. It's called, I believe, apprenticeship and training under Section 3114, which provides that the Commissioner of the Department of Labor can issue regulations to provide wages below whatever the stated minimum wage is for apprenticeship and training programs. So the mechanism already exists. We don't have to pass this new law. We don't have to get into the issue of service charge, tips, et cetera, It is there. I believe under the existing laws, the certificates that are issued by the Department of Labor under that mechanism are good for up to 1 year. So that means recent high school graduate or even high school dropout could go get a job and be trained at, let's say, $6.25 an hour for a period of up to 1 year at the discretion of the Department of Labor. So you have the Department of Labor oversight of this type of apprenticeship and training program, but also allows the, employee to get some on-the-job experience, and also it's a more fair exchange for the employer taking a chance on this person who doesn't have the skills or training to adequately do the job. And honestly, they're not worth $8.25, $9.20, $10.10 an hour. I have no choice. The employee that I have, it's not a skilled position, but I have no choice. I have to pay them minimum $8.25 an hour, even though their productivity is probably around $4 an hour. Okay? But I'm willing to do that because I, as a starting entrepreneur, I have a vision for where my business will be. But every time something like this happens, you're basically killing my future aspirations. And I know a lot of other people who are in the same boat. Basically, their vision of expansion, their ideas of sales growth is killed every time the government, whether it's the legislative, executive, what have you, does something to incur additional cost. For example, I think a relevant point to make right now is that wages aren't the only cost for someone like me. Earlier this month, the Port Authority has approved an increase in tariffs. I'm not a shipper, but I know that's going to affect my bottom line because almost everything I produce or I make has to be shipped in. So when you're talking about, do we or don't we apply the tip credit, that's there's a very simple solution. You erase one line from one section. Do we implement lower, training wages or apprenticeship wages? That's easy to do because it's already built into the Guam Code. All it needs is regulation. It doesn't even need a new law. It's already been authorized. But all of these things don't go to the core of what my problem is, which is every action that's taken where it might have a 10% effect or 20% effect on various businesses that have, say, 3, 4, 5, 10 employees or more, it has a much more significant effect on a person like me who has one part-time employee and is barely making. But as I said, if you would like the references to the sections again, I do have it available for anyone who needs it.
Well done. Well said.
I want to go back to the reality right here on our island. Maybe because I visit a lot of high schools to get a workforce growing in the industry I work for. Like Mr. Johnson said, a gentleman here to my right saying, you don't need any skills to work in the industry. It's very fast. From even still in high school, you can still work in the industry, and we do all the training. But the issue I wanna state here for everybody to understand is that the values what we have today is different when we were growing up and how to reproductive and how we do things. Sometimes a mother's making $8.25 and a kid just graduated from high school comes in and work also making $8.25. There's a lot of difference on their sense of value. I want to go to work today because I can work $8.25. I'm not against the minimum wage. I'm the issue in the professional development for the kids in our island also, and migrants coming in saying, I want to start somewhere. And learn how to do the skills that we're going to offer them through training, OJT, or when we send them to other institutions to get some learning skills, basic learning skills, which also a GT we do for like customer service, for instance. And that's what we need to do. But I found out that the values of today's children that are coming to the workforce is like, well, I got a car from my dad. I got a place to stay. I want $8.25. So when they come to work, there's not that much productivity you get on an 8-hour day. I mean, it's not like when we were growing up and you have to work forever to get $1.50 or sell newspapers in the meantime. But we need to put that development, like Mr. said, to have some kind of learning curve in there to go in there and say, hey, progressive learning, you can get more. Through time, yeah. But once you get 18, maybe you can get a full minimum wage. But that's the issue that I wanted for our people here that will live on this island to make a quality of life better for all of us. You need to learn it. When you join the Army, you're not a sergeant right away. You have to start from E1 and learn your step to earn that right to get that more pay, more rank. So I believe that a progressive method of going into that $8.25 or $9.20 has to be earned.
How are we going to impart these values?
Well, it starts with me. It starts with us. It starts with the home, I believe. You know, I'm Chamorro. I'm from Guam. It was different the way I was brought up to today. You know, we take everything for granted. Back then, you have to like work 3 jobs, and stuff like that to make a living.
What role would the government play in this importing of values?
Well, as we speak, we have people on here that's doing a workforce development. And I think that's very important, that we should be part of that headquarters to support the Department of Labor and this workforce developments that we run, because our economy is growing. And it's going to grow even better and bigger once the military start bringing it up. So we need to do that. We're still not at the 5-star level yet, as people want us to be, or the expectation of visitors when they come in and say, hey, I expect this today. They're not getting it. So I believe all of this for the government to work with us together in partnership, the labor and the private sector, to this workforce development, to instill that sense of value for us, because it's not there anymore, you know. Have you ever guys gone to a PTA meeting? How many parents are there today? I can tell you because I don't have any kids in elementary, but I go there just to see what really makes us tick, what makes this local people tick, and how we progress into the future for our kids and our grandkids. So it's important that the sense of value is back in there. So progressive workforce in there, professional development, and it starts with us here today to make this work for a future of
Okay, I appreciate that perspective. I certainly do. I've allowed the conversation to kind of digress so you can put everything on the table. There'll always be philosophical arguments in favor of and against the minimum wage increase, and those are all very important. What I want to get through is the practical realities and the implication of anything that we do, the benefits, the consequences, which is why we kind of all agreed earlier that when the minimum wage was to be increased by $1, any further increases will be as a result of a study that the government was going to commission. But what do you do when the government doesn't have that study yet and it's 9 months delayed? So, I mean, that's what we're going to have to sort out. The Vice Speaker's indicated that he still would like to have a discussion, and we should always have this kind of discussion absent a study. I'm here tonight, and we're here tonight because we have received some feedback from industry employees that their hourly wage is being reduced because of tips, whether it's tips or service charge. And I wanted to generate public awareness. If the law and what Department of Labor is saying, that the law is that it's minimum wage plus tips. Service charge is entirely up to the employer to do as they please with the service charge. But if you're going to share that service charge with the employee, it's minimum wage plus whatever service charge you're going to share with the employee. I want one for us, at least this phase 1 of this discussion, to have this kind of understanding. There's been an interest to restore tip credit, but that would have to, I guess, further discussions, but we have to have that conversation. But I just don't see myself supporting a tip credit without raising the minimum wage. It seems like we're going backwards. We're trying to find what's in the best interest of the employee. I know we all want to do what's in the best interest of the employee, and I don't think it's in the best interest of the employee if we restore tip credit status quo minimum wage. Do you agree, Frank?
Well, you definitely have a point. Nobody's going to argue that.
I just don't want this bill to evolve into
Yeah.
to restore tip credit, but the minimum wage remains the same.
Yeah. I mean, there'd be a lot of people. I mean, I think everybody here at the table understands that. I mean, maybe one of the reasons behind roundtable discussions like this is to come up with alternatives. So this was an alternative that was brought to the table, but it's never been done on Guam, right? So it'd be like a little bit of a shock, right? Because since 1961, you got to pay the minimum wage plus. Maybe other things can be looked at also. It's like, why do we have to go up whole dollars, when we go up? Maybe we can go up, 45 cents, 50 cents.
I mean, you're right. Some states have taken their minimum wage increase up to 2020. So they've spread it out.
Yeah, but a lot of those states are the more well-to-do, affluent states and/or.
Yeah,
Even those.
They've
I mean,
spread it
that's
out
Seattle, right? That's New York City, right?
California.
So we can't really compare, us and our.
No, but your suggestion is spread it out. I mean, it's something that's been done.
Yeah, in lower amounts. Because to increase it, $2.85 over the course of 3 years, now 4 years, maybe 5 years, whatever it is, it's still significant. And nobody's going to argue periodic minimum wage increases, right? We all know as a community and business people and economics that there will come times in which this issue needs to be done and raised. But all I'm saying is that maybe we can look at it and make it more equitable to all parties, because when we get big amounts like this, like our gentleman over there had shared, it's going to impact him and others significantly. They'll close their doors, and rightfully so, and stop business. And then the taxes that was maybe generated from him times 100 companies like his would be lost, to the government.
And that's what I was going to add is with regards to the tip credit. Now, like as Mr. Sung said, there are a lot of employees. Remember, service industry employees, not all of them are eligible for tip credit. So when you're talking about minimum wage increases, that really affects the overall operations of the business. Not everybody will be in that category for tip credit.
Well, I imagine this is why the turnout tonight is pretty much F&B, because we made it clear that we're going to discuss
that, right?
Yeah.
But there are other ramifications to
which
it.
is
So
why
when
we're going to have another series of
Right.
roundtable meetings, so we could just flush this out.
Yeah, but I think it's good that we've had this roundtable discussion. I think I want to thank you for personally, making sure that this is on the table before it actually goes on session floor or whatever. But it's very important that we always include the stakeholders, especially our public partners with the Department of Labor. And as Mr. Sung said, there's always programs available, and I think that is the thing that's missing. Is we talk about those in poverty, those who are in part-time status or whatever. There are programs already in place that I know Department of Labor. I work closely with them on so many programs, and that's where we need to get better. Is the collaboration and the coordination of those programs so that we can benefit those individuals who are in the EITC to get out of that level and get more skills into the workforce. And we kind of always bypass that. Whenever we have these discussions over the last couple of years, we always mention education, we mention workforce development, we mention apprenticeship, and all those other things that are going to create more skilled workers. And as Senor Blas mentioned, the hospitality industry, most of those jobs are just basic level entry. They don't require a lot of high skills. So our job as private sector is really to create jobs, and we don't want to hinder our opportunity to create more jobs. We want to provide those jobs for individuals, and we want to make sure it's fair. So we appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion. I know you're going to have more.
But to Department of Labor's credit, they've been pretty aggressive with
Yes.
workforce development programs.
Oh yeah, definitely, and that's why I'm
Even with prison
recognizing
industries
them. Because as Mr. Song mentioned, those are the ways to tackle the issues you're really talking about, the heart of the issues. That is actually how you do it. You don't do it by increasing minimum wage. You go and tackle the issues at hand, whether they're, the undeveloped skills or the uneducated, and getting them the education they need and this basic skill set so they could get a job. That is what we need to work at, and that's what I would implore the senators to look at. There's a lot of opportunities that, our former Senator Sam Mabini, now director, has gone after. And she got good news that she has more grant money awarded today from the federal government. But there's so many opportunities, and like I said, it takes collaboration and coordination of efforts. And Chamber, GHRA, Employers Council, Contractors Association all represent the largest industries, and we are working together with DOL on that. And that's the kind of the hidden story behind all of this is we're not there just to pay wages. We're there to also create jobs and get people trained. We do that as part of our operational budget. That's what service charge, some of it goes to training, actually. And that's our public-private partnership with the government agencies. So I think we're all doing that, and we want to keep sharing that message because there's more opportunities to battle the issues you're really battling rather than just always increasing minimum wage.
I also wanted to add that in my business, we don't charge.
I was just going to say
service charge.
Or tips.
Or tips.
Yeah.
And so we have to go with the minimum wage.
Because you're fast food.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So obviously they've got an advantage with this type of charge. And so with us, we have to go straight out. So personally, we would prefer to then control. Why do we have to be the leaders on increasing minimum wage? It's going to be inevitable that, the U.S. is going to raise minimum wage, but do we have to lead that? Are we at that point where we need to, say, okay, is Guam ahead of these other states to a point where we have to increase minimum wage? And it will eventually go back to the customers. That's what happened the last time. I think that's what happened with the Department of Labor. You'll see that. I mean, the businesses have to be profitable, right? So if they're not profitable, just like a gentleman here, they're going to go under. So it's, there's a lot of things with employers, exemption, non-exempt employees and exempt employees. That's going to go up. The cost of shipping now, weight scales are going to go into effect. I mean, it is very expensive to do business out here. So we... So we don't have, that mechanism to help offset whatever you increase goes straight, and it'll affect our business greatly. So that's our side. I'm sure there's a lot of other fast food businesses that don't do the service charge or tips.
Yeah, I'm one of them.
Okay.
Subway. Let me give you a number since the minimum wage increased to $8.25. Our labor cost has gone up 5%, and we had to reduce our staff in order to compensate without raising menu prices from 120 to 105 workers across our 14 locations. So there's 15 people now that don't have a job because we have to be competitive. And when you increase it at the minimum wage, it's just not one person. It's the senior sandwich artist, it's the supervisor. Everyone has to get a bump. So it's very expensive. And it's making it very difficult, and I think you'll see a lot of negative consequences if it continues.
And I think Mary can probably relate to this too, because she at one point was in the insurance industry as well. Coming from an insurance perspective, a benefits perspective, and I think Jeff and I had this conversation not too long ago as well. What is it? What are some of the? You started increasing the minimum wage, et cetera, et cetera. What are some of the sacrifices that employers going to do? They're going to look at benefits. They're going to look at, say, group life insurance benefits and say, you know what, I can't seem to afford this because of the fact that my costs are going to go up. They look at medical insurance benefits and they say, you know what, now I'm going to have to start looking at higher deductible programs to help lower my actual costs to provide medical insurance benefits to my employees. Unlike with the government of Guam, which says, okay, everything's on a silver platter, we have to give the employees everything. The private sector, unfortunately, does not have that option. So the impact is moves into the benefits, but a benefit circle as well, where the insurance companies are looking and saying, this is going to start impacting, our operations as well, because the cost of doing business, the cost of actually running an operation, is getting higher and higher every single day. So it's, the parameters are great. I mean, it's just something to look at from all perspectives. But I just wanted to kind of share that because from a benefits perspective, it does create an impact.
The increase in their labor was 5%. You know the average net profit of the businesses in the United States is 5%. That's the average net profit that they end up. So when businesses are faced with a 5% increase, it's a huge matter because it could be the difference between making money and losing money. And so what businesses do when you have these increases is they find other ways to cut costs because they can't cut the employees' costs because that's required. So we got to pay $8.25. So where else can we cut costs? Okay, maybe it's less employees. Maybe it's less benefits for our employees. Maybe it's not opening that next restaurant or next store, and creating more jobs. So all of these decisions have impacts on business because businesses are designed to survive, and so they have to do what it takes to survive. Otherwise, they'll be out of business. And so ultimately, that's these decisions aren't made in a vacuum. There's going to be consequences. So
one of the practical impacts, I guess I wanted to bring this up was previously during the formal public hearing regarding this bill, I spoke on the issue of wholesale egg prices. And one of the other senators had come up to me after that hearing and said, do you feel that the minimum wage increase was the main impetus for the increase in the wholesale egg prices going up to twice what they used to be 2 years ago? And I said, I'm assuming that's not the only reason, but given the fact that you have a supply chain and each party in the supply chain now has increased expenditures, of course there's going to be a ripple effect. Now, one of the ways that I believe Fiji, who recently also raised their port tariffs by approximately 30%, one of the ways that they're dealing with it, and one of the ways that some local vendors are dealing with it, is they're bringing in cheaper products. Whether it's by quality or design or what have you, the price for that particular item, it's not from the same company, it's a different brand, maybe it's a different supplier, et cetera, et cetera. That's the only other way that they're able to provide that same product and put on the shelves here today. Eggs, I think, is one of the better examples simply because everyone eats eggs, everyone sees eggs, everyone knows what they are. If you consider a 7% increase per year over the next 3 years at the port for tariff fees, and you consider the minimum wage for various workers through the supply chain, etc., you have a significant, practical, real impact of what you're trying to help this guy over here kind of messes up the program for everyone else.
It's interesting, perusing all these articles and so on, and all the issues, come across a number of creative approaches as well, positive creative approaches. And one of them, service charge. Some service industries, primarily hospitality organizations, are using the service charge, calling it something else, and having more than one. Service charge for the waiters and waitresses, service charge for the cooks, for the chefs and so on. Just a little creativity there. So these are some of the things that we might want to consider as well as we're looking at all the issues.
Fuel service charge.
Service is great. The food is service is great, but the food is awful. But thank you for getting it here on time. But it tastes like hell.
Go to my house.
I just want to also ask the Department of Labor, are you seeing this problem with tip credit prevalent on Guam, Roman?
Well, not too much of a problem. There was one employer that was assuming that the employees were getting the tips, but they were not. So I had to make that employer pay back all those tips that he reported back to the employee, and it resolved it. But there's not too many in the service industry. The only problem with the provision that we have is, like I said, the not including the tips and gratuity of any kind with the minimum wage. Because back then, yes, I've been encountering how they were doing it, but when I compute their wages, it comes up to minimum wage. So I really don't do anything. I don't go after them because they are making the minimum wage. It's just that our provision does not allow me as an enforcer to use the federal, because we are more beneficial to the employees right now. That's why my hands are tied when I'm going to go back to a federal and use it, which I can't. But the service industries are making that minimum wage, based on when we do audits. But I always tell them that, our provision of the law says you can't include tips and gratuity to offset the minimum wage.
Go ahead.
Well, I've been doing wage and salary and benefit surveys on Guam for about 30 years now. And I frequently encounter, shall we say, some transgressions. And the tipped credit was one. Typically I ask them, give me the actual base rate of pay for each person in this given job. And frequently, and particularly in some of the service jobs, I'll come back with, well, we're paying $513, in more than one company. And so when I get something like that, I have to call and give them a little education. Do you want me to put this into the survey report? No. Do you want to change it? Okay. Yes, please. Because if I do issue a report and someone looks at the lowest rate paid and the highest rate paid, and the lowest is $513, it's going to raise a question somewhere, if not in your office, someplace else. So
And just so you
the answer
know,
to the question is, I do encounter
So you are
a lot
encountering
of
it,
Yeah.
That's why we're here tonight.
but also since the minimum wage hearing earlier this summer, Guam Chamber of Commerce, the Society of Human Resource Management, GHRA, have all worked with both Patrick Cadaleta and Roman Kanata on doing outreach to the businesses. So they've had different, lectures, workshops, seminars to get the word out, to share this, because there was a lot of confusion and misunderstanding, lack of knowledge on this. So we've been doing this outreach over the last couple of months, and they've been very gracious with their time to make sure they come out to, the general membership meetings, the actual workshops, and even to our HR committee, so that everybody understands the law, both federal and local.
But even with those outreach efforts, there's still a lot of ambiguity.
Well, there are a lot of
There's some-
businesses that aren't
there's some
necessarily
that-
members of our organizations.
Or even members, even GHR members, they want to lean to what the federal policy is.
Needs to be clarified.
It needs to be, yeah.
So I'm
And so
wondering-
that's why we've given suggestions on certain things so that we can get
There's
clarification
still
on it.
students out there that
Of
don't want to go
course.
to class.
Well, of course.
Unfortunately.
So based on that, I'm going to suggest that the Director of Labor maybe reach out to the Attorney General. She does her It's the Law public education campaign, and if could be in agreement, that might be a good start. I mean, if the Attorney General is saying that this is the law, then that's
Right, and
that's
just
your
for,
enforcement.
and just for a point of clarification, back in June, we did send a letter of inquiry for clarification as far as defining the gratuities of any kind.
To the Attorney General?
Yes, so we're still awaiting their interpretation, just FYI.
That's why you got confirmed 15-0, because you're always a step ahead.
So, some of the issues in the regular rate of pay when you look at it versus service charge, sometimes it's the formula on how you get back to the regular rate of pay when you include service charge. Service charge distribution is a discriminatory issue from the employer. and we give it to the employee or not. So that's the issue when you.
But you give it to the employee on top of their
Yes.
$8.25 an hour.
Exactly,
Yeah,
because and not only that, there's other issues too that we get back from the service charge uniform, all this other
No,
issues.
nobody
that
tonight's telling you
Yeah.
how to spend your
Right.
service charge revenue.
yeah.
There, that's not
It's
the
your
issue.
revenue.
Yes.
Service
Yeah,
charge is revenue. How
But
much
I
you
don't
wanna
think
do with it,
the
it's up to you.
Yeah.
it's never the
That's
intent
right.
to tell businesses how to do business. It's
Exactly,
just.
Oh, right.
No, I'm sorry.
Can you say that again?
I speak for myself.
I'm gonna write this
But
down here.
before we adjourn this hearing, want to give the vice speaker an opportunity. You're good. But the vice speaker has also been very patient because, as you know, it made it on the agenda, and he was the one who made the motion to bring it back to committee so we could iron these things out. So if there's no further comments, we'll adjourn this portion of this hearing, and then we'll regroup at some point next week or. Okay. Thank you.
No, girl. You're the expert as far as I'm concerned.